Oh, sorry. Good morning, everyone. So part of my role is to look at data accuracy and data quality in ARIN's database and look at ways to improve it. So I periodically track POC validation stats, and I also work on ways to improve it, to improve them. So I did this presentation 1 year ago in New Orleans, and we have some difference in the data, so I'm going to talk about that a little bit. So the policy itself is NRPM 3.6, the annual Who is POC validation. And there's sort of three main components to it. There's a bit of extra, but I'm only going to talk about these 3 points. Email is sent annually to every registered POC in ARIN's Who is. The POC point of contact, by the way, in case some people don't know what that means. The POC has 60 days to respond with an affirmative that their contact information is correct. If ARIN staff deems a POC to be abandoned or otherwise illegitimate, the POC record shall be marked invalid. So, I'm going to give you some stats, lots of numbers. So right now we have 883,414 total points of contact registered in ARIN's database. 226,000 plus are validated. Validated means that they've either responded to ARIN's annual POC validation email or they've come in separately and updated their POC record within the past 12 months. Either way will validate the record. So 26% of all points of contact in ARIN's database are valid or have been validated. 656,655 are non-validated. That means 74% of all POCs in ARIN's database are non-valid, have not been validated or updated. So I've broken the numbers down into direct and indirect POC validation stats. Direct POCs are those that are associated with organizations that have received resources directly from ARIN or from one of ARIN's predecessor registries. Indirect POCs are associated with organizations that have received reassignments from upstream ISPs. So total direct POCs are 51,868. 27,718 are validated, and 24,150 are non-validated. Of the total indirect POCs, we've got 831,570. So the majority of points of contact in ARIN's database are reassignments put in by upstream ISPs. 202,203 are validated, and 629,000 are non-validated. So I have another kind of way of looking at this, I think in another slide. Perhaps not, let's see. Yeah, I do. Okay. Sorry, got carried away with the Miami Vice colors. So direct and indirect POC validation stats. This is another way of looking at that previous slide. We've got 51,868 direct POCs. 47% of them are non-validated, and 53% of them are validated. That's really almost 50-50 for direct POCs, people that interact directly with ARIN. It's not a great stat. Looking at the indirects, of the 831,000, 76% of them are non-validated, and 24% of them are validated. So this is another way of looking at POC validation. We actually pulled the ARIN-issued networks. We look at how many ARIN-issued networks have validated POCs and how many legacy networks have validated POCs. So we have almost 30,000 ARIN-issued networks registered in the database. There are currently only 8% of them that have no valid POC at all associated with the network. And 92% of them have at least one validated POC associated. When you look at the legacy networks, there's 24,758. 54% of them have no valid POC, and 46% of them have at least one valid POC. So, I mean, it does show that legacy networks are, alive and awake and paying some attention. They are validating somewhat. So, interesting comparative data. I told you I did this a year ago. And a year ago, there were 6,000, there were 6,000 more legacy networks registered in the database. So now there's 6,000 fewer. And when we dug into that to look at why, it appears that half of them became ARIN-issued networks as a result of an 8.3 transfer. Those are the specified market-based transfers within the ARIN region. And then the other half went to other RARs as the result of inter-RAR transfers. They moved out of the ARIN region. So 6,000 legacy networks were changed status, essentially. Another point that I don't have on here is, and actually I'm going to go back real quick because I should have said this in the beginning. Overall, 26% of our POCs are not validating. That is as of today. Are validated, I'm sorry. 1 year ago, 30% of our POCs overall were validated. So the numbers actually dropped down. Even though we're working on ways to improve POC validation and making communications better, et cetera, less people are validating their POCs. So, some conclusions on this. Direct POCs are validating more often than indirect POCs, but there's definitely room for improvement. We saw that in the slides. ARIN-issued networks are far more likely than legacy networks to have at least one validated POC. We saw that in the slides. This annual POC validation policy may not be working as intended if only 26% of all registered POCs are actually validating their POC data, and that number has gone down in the past year. And it appears that the transfer policies are clearly working as intended because unused IPv4 address space is being reissued to organizations in need, with half staying in the ARIN region and half going to organizations in other regions. And that is all I have. Are there any questions on that?
Any questions for Leslie?
Andrew Dull, I have a question about legacy, the legacy POCs. How many of the 50% which are non-validated are abandoned blocks?
What would you mean by abandoned?
Not routed, nobody's ever seen them, things like that.
We don't have an accurate assessment of abandoned to compare that with. Someone could go generate one, but we have not done so. There's actually another question, which is, how many of the POCs have no resources at all associated with them? They're just a POC.
I'm not is that included in, that was a statistic I remember seeing last year that
You're
they
going
were.
to see
You're going to see that in about an hour.
Okay.
I have another one.
Are you trying to set yourself up for an easy question later?
Because those are going away.
Okay. Anyway, I think it would be interesting to know for some definition of abandoned of that 54%. Basically, they're just really old.
Your definition is not visible on the public network.
That would be one definition that would be easily able to be rectified.
Do you have any stats on networks being used in private networks that don't tell you they're being used?
I do not, but
There may be someone with those stats, but they're creative people if there are.
Well, yeah.
Okay. Yes, Owen.
Owen DeLong, your company name here. There are, to Andrew's point, it would be useful to know what percentage of the networks that are not validating their POCs are also not visible on the internet, and it would be interesting to know if there is any way to validate that the organization in question even still exists and things like that. I realize that's quite a lot of work, perhaps, and that maybe there's no there, but if we can identify that the organization doesn't exist and the network's not announced and et cetera, then perhaps we need, I realize, policy language to support this, but perhaps it's time to consider publishing in the paper of record or something like that for some period of time, that if said organization does not get in contact with ARIN and update their information, we are going to presume the resources are abandoned and therefore recycle them.
So I have good news for you. The good news is that there's teams of people out there looking at those networks right now. As we sit here, there are people doing research on those networks. Now, they're actually looking for ones that aren't announced and do have organizations, as opposed to not announced with defunct organizations. Well, actually, the defunct organizations work as long as there's a legal successor of some type, because those networks have value. Because of the transfer market now, every one of those networks can be put into a market. And there are people who are actually actively doing this, which is why the number of networks is dropping. It dropped, as you can see, we had 6,000 networks disappear over the course of 2 meetings. So there is a pressure mechanism that works now. It is true that that will only go so far, and we may need to
Well-
look at, yes?
A clarification on that. All 6,000 of those networks didn't have valid POCs?
No, those are 6,000 total. We don't know how many didn't have
Right.
POCs or didn't.
So this is
But
my
there are
point.
organizations who are actively trying to find, some of the brokers are actively trying to find the underlying organization. They're not working off the POC list. They're literally looking at the unannounced networks. So there is a back pressure that applies now. ARIN can do, happy to go explore whatever you want, but the work involved is very high if we take that on as opposed to leaving it in the market. Your call.
Understood. Thank you.
Back microphone?
Bloomberg The Wire. I think that the legacy scrap reclaimers are doing an excellent job of finding all of those little tidbits out there, and I really don't see a value in spending money and resources to find stuff that people are actively going out and doing, especially when we have a fee discussion later on. My bigger concern is the 50% of, Leslie, if you can go back, the direct POCs. That's the one that really worries me. Indirect is the reassignments downstream. This is a big issue. We've got policy to deal with that. But I'm more concerned with the direct POCs, the ones that ARIN has a relationship, should have a relationship with. That number is as a user, pitiful, and that would be where the attention really needs to be spent. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, any other questions for Leslie? No?
Thank you.
Thank you.